What if I told you that one of the best teams of the 90s never even made it to a Super Bowl? Sounds impossible, right? Yet, that was the fate of the 1998 Vikings. They had the highest scoring offense in NFL history, numerous Hall of Famers, yet somehow they fell short. So what happened? Well, in order to find out, we need to go back to the beginning. In 1997, the Vikings finished 4th in the NFC Central with a 9-7 record. They did make it to the playoffs though, since the rest of the NFC were pretty average, but they could only win one game before losing to the Niners. This was a team that was in desperate need for improvements. They were the 11th ranked offense and the 19th ranked defense, and when it came to yardage, they were the second worst team in the entire NFL. But the offseason would be full of drama, because the team had just been bought by Red McCombs, so the new boss syndrome was in full effect. McCombs and his aides weren't interested in pretty good seasons. They wanted a Super Bowl, and they weren't shy about telling Coach Dennis Green his job depended on it. The roster looked solid on paper, but the quarterback situation was a massive if, because Brad Johnson was coming off neck surgery that had literally left his throwing hand numb, and his backup was Randall Cunningham, a guy many thought was a relic of the past. Sure, the offense had legendary talent in Chris Carter and Jake Reed, but everyone knew they needed a X factor to truly break the league. And with the 21st pick of the NFL draft, they got exactly that, wide receiver Randy Moss. But here's the thing. Everyone in the NFL saw this as a massive gamble that could blow up in the Vikings' face. Why? Because Moss had a history of off-field issues. Coach Green, though, saw a young man who had turned the corner. And in Week 1 of the 1998 season, the NFL was about to change forever. When the Week 1 game against the Bucs started, it looked like a coronation, because Brad Johnson's neck surgery proved to be a non-factor. He sliced through one of the league's best defenses for 4 touchdowns. But the real story was the rookie. In his debut match, Randy Moss didn't just play, he terrorized the Bucs. On his first career catch, the ball was actually tipped into the air, but because Moss had superhuman concentration, he snatched it and walked into the end zone for a 48-yard score. The Vikings rolled to a 31-7 blowout. But if Week 1 was a statement, Week 2 was a street fight. The Vikings headed to St. Louis to face the Rams, and everything looked perfect early on. But the game quickly turned into a chaotic shootout that almost derailed their season, because the Rams had their own superstar in Isaac Bruce. Bruce was putting on a clinic with 192 receiving yards. If that wasn't bad enough, the rookie phenom Randy Moss was held to 0 touchdowns. The Vikings needed a hero to stop the bleeding, but they didn't find him in the air. The Rams' defense was so worried about Moss and Carter, they left a canyon-sized hole in the middle of the field. Robert Smith took a handoff and sprinted 74 yards for a touchdown. Smith ended the day with a massive 179 yards, proving that if you tried to take away the deep ball, the Vikings would simply run the bus right over you. But in the middle of the fourth quarter, the Vikings' worst nightmare came true. Brad Johnson, the man who had just finished rehab for neck surgery, went down with a sprained ankle. Was the season over just as it started? Well, what if I told you that this is the moment the legend of the 1998 Vikings truly began? Because they had Randall Cunningham, who was the best backup quarterback there ever was, according to Randy Moss. And Cunningham did the furthest thing from failing. He immediately led the game-winning drive, helping the Vikings go 2-0. But if they wanted to complete a perfect season, it was now resting on the shoulders of a 35-year-old backup. But Week 3 was the ultimate litmus test for the Vikings' depth, because Chris Carter was limping around with both a sore calf, and Brad Johnson was officially ruled out. The unbeatable Vikings suddenly looked vulnerable, and they would be facing their division rival, the Detroit Lions, who brought the greatest running back on earth, Barry Sanders, into the Metrodome. And when the game kicked off, the Vikings looked human for the first time. At halftime, the score was a measly 6-6, and Barry Sanders had already ripped off 57 yards. But then, the third quarter happened, and everything changed because of a forgotten weapon. On a punt return, David Palmer froze 3 defenders, cut back against the grain, and sprinted 44 yards to the Detroit 11-yard line. That one spark ignited the stadium. Cunningham was able to thread a needle to Randy Moss for a 5-yard touchdown. Suddenly, the old man QB and the rookie kid were in perfect sync. The offense was doing enough, but the defense decided to end the conversation entirely. They didn't just slow down Barry Sanders, they buried him. After his hot start, the Vikings held the legendary Sanders to a pathetic 12 yards in the second half. The Vikings walked away with a 29-6 blowout, but the stats looked rather weird, because Randy Moss only had 37 yards and the running game was stifled. So it became clear that this wasn't just a good team. It was a team so deep that even when the superstars had a bad day, they still won by 23 points. The Vikings were flying high at 3-0. But Week 4 was that classic trap game. Sure, it was against the winless Chicago Bears, but the Bears were desperate, a team with nothing to lose. So by halftime, the unbeatable Vikings were staring at an 11-point deficit. It looked like the 1998 Magic was about to evaporate, but Chicago had a dark secret. They were the worst second-half team in the league, so the Vikings didn't panic. And now with the door kicked open, Randall Cunningham turned the second half into his personal highlight reel. He went 11 for 14, finding Chris Carter for a lead-changing score, and then he launched a 44-yard bomb to Randy Moss. The Vikings walked away with a 31-28 win to move to 4-0. The Vikings survived. They left the locker room looking like they'd been in a car wreck. Green called it the most physical game of the year, leaving the team bruised, battered, and heading straight into a collision course with none other than the undefeated Packers. Green Bay held a 25-game regular season home winning streak at Lambeau Field, so everyone expected the Vikings to be just another victim. But by the end of the night, the legend of Lambeau was in tatters by a rookie named Randy Moss. When the game began, the world was waiting for Brett Favre to assert dominance. Instead, it was Randall Cunningham who looked like the three-time MVP. Cunningham torched the number 1 ranked defense for 442 yards and 4 touchdowns. But while Cunningham was the pilot, Randy Moss was the nuclear warhead. He only caught 5 passes, but he turned those into a staggering 190 yards and 2 touchdowns. The final score was 37-24, but the game wasn't even that close. For the first time in years, the Packers were physically and mentally outclassed at home. The Vikings moved to 5-0 and took sole possession of first place in the NFC Central, but the victory felt bigger than a single game because they had walked into the most intimidating stadium in the league and dismantled the defending NFC champions. The rest of the NFL finally realized that the offensive tsunami wasn't a fluke, so the Vikings entered the bye week as the undisputed team to beat. Minnesota, though, have a long, painful tradition of starting fast and then stumbling. In Week 6, the winless Redskins were coming to the Metrodome, and what if I told you the pressure was actually higher than it was in Green Bay? The media predicted an upset, but the Vikings claimed they had the leadership to avoid the pitfalls of the past. Randall Cunningham continued to shock the league as he was playing at an MVP level. The Vikings remained undefeated and ready to prove they weren't the same old choke artists. Cunningham entered Week 8 with 12 touchdowns, 0 interceptions, and a league-leading passer rating. But against the Lions, the Vikings wanted to prove they were a tsunami on both sides of the ball. The game ended with a 34-13 victory to move the Vikings to 7-0. They were winning by an average of 3 touchdowns, so the media began calling them the New York Yankees of the NFL. But then, the reality check. As perfect as they looked, critics pointed out that most of their wins came against teams with losing records. If that wasn't bad enough, Dennis Green was adamant that his backup is still a backup, and the moment Brad Johnson was healthy, he would be back in the lineup. And perhaps this QB controversy finally started to rattle the locker room. After weeks of looking invincible, the Goliath of the NFC was brought down by a 27-24 loss to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. It was a loss which exposed a glaring weakness. They can, in fact, be bullied. The Bucs didn't try to outpass the Vikings, they simply ran through them. But now, with the perfect season pressure gone, the focus shifts back to the QB room. Brad Johnson is getting healthier, but Cunningham remains the league's top-rated passer despite the loss. But as fate would have it, Randall Cunningham was forced out early in Week 10 with an injury. Enter Brad Johnson, returning from his own broken leg to take the field for the first time in 8 weeks, and nobody could have anticipated how well Johnson played right away. He managed to lead the game-winning drive, even throwing a spectacular left-handed pass to Leroy Hoard. But things went from bad to worse for Minnesota. Johnson finished the game with a broken right thumb, so by the end of the afternoon, both QBs were sidelined. The media started buzzing that the perfect season was over. But Randall Cunningham is apparently made of different stuff. Cunningham decided to remind everyone why he's an MVP candidate. He launched a massive 61-yard bomb to the rookie sensation Randy Moss. The game turned into a 24-3 blowout before the Bengals even knew what hit them. But Week 12 was the biggest game of the year. The Packers came into the Metrodome expecting to reclaim their throne, but instead, they walked into a buzzsaw. The biggest question was how Randy Moss would play. He had already torched them in Week 5, so many believed that Green Bay would be ready for him this time. So what does Moss do? He goes out and catches 8 passes for 153 yards, including a 49-yard dagger of a touchdown that effectively ended the game. On the other side, John Randall was a nightmare for Favre, recording a sack and a forced fumble. The defense was just as hungry as the offense. So, the Vikings completed their first season sweep of the Packers since 1993 with a 28-14 victory. The Vikings are now 10-1 and have the NFC Central virtually locked up. But the schedule doesn't get any easier because they have to turn right around and play on Thanksgiving Day, and Randy Moss would have to handle the Deion Sanders test in Dallas. Fortunately for the Vikings, Sanders was sidelined with a toe injury, and because the Cowboys were forced to use backup cornerbacks and rookies against the most explosive player in football, the result was a bloodbath. Randy Moss put on a performance that had John Madden calling him the best receiver in the NFL before the first quarter was even over. Moss only had 3 catches the entire game, but every single one of them was a touchdown. But while Moss was grabbing the headlines, Gary Anderson quietly kept his own piece of history alive. He didn't miss a single kick because he has been arguably the most consistent player in the league all year. The Vikings were now 11-1 after destroying the Cowboys 46-36. Unfortunately, there is one dark cloud over the victory. Star running back Robert Smith left the game with a sprained knee. So, the Vikings head home to face Chicago, needing just one more win to officially clinch the division title. But they would have to get it done with a junior varsity lineup. They went into the game without their starting QB, their star running back, and 2 of their top 3 receivers. Many expected Randy Moss to struggle, but instead, Moss just kept scaling new heights. He hauled in 3 more touchdowns, bringing his league-leading total to 14. Moss proved he is essentially unguardable. The Vikings cruised to a 48-22 victory, sewing up the NFC Central title and securing a first-round playoff bye. But if you thought the team would ease off the gas, think again. The Vikings put together a historic 50-10 demolition of the Jaguars. The win locked up home field advantage for the playoffs. Now the Vikings needed just 12 points against the Oilers to make history, completing the highest scoring single season in NFL history. And they didn't disappoint, beating the Oilers 26-16. It was a historic 15-1 regular season, joining an elite club as only the 3rd team in NFL history to accomplish the feat. They were the number 1 ranked offense and the number 6 ranked defense. But the season would be a big waste if they didn't make it count in the playoffs. But the divisional playoffs would prove to be no different. The Vikings rolled up 416 total yards. They proved you cannot isolate one aspect of their offense. If you cover Randy Moss and Chris Carter, running back Robert Smith will slash you for 124 yards. Final score 41-26. But with just one match away from making the Super Bowl, the highest scoring offense in the history of professional football completely lost its identity. Against the Falcons, Minnesota managed a meager 7 points after halftime. And here's the thing, Cunningham and Moss established themselves early on, but the Falcons made sure to adjust. Atlanta committed to heavy double coverage on Moss for the remainder of the afternoon. And when you take one guy out, someone else has to step up. And it just didn't happen on the day. But late in the game, the Vikings led 27-20, and with just over 2 minutes to play, a Gary Anderson field goal would give them a 10-point lead and certain victory. He hadn't missed a single kick all year. He makes this, and the game is over. But for the first time in 2 years, the ball sailed wide. It felt like a punch to the stomach. With 57 seconds left, Atlanta tied it. Overtime would decide who went to Super Bowl 33. But going into overtime, the Vikings had lost 5 starters to injuries. On offense, the continuity was gone, and then came the final sequence. Atlanta's Morton Anderson now faced the exact same uprights from the exact same distance. The stadium went quiet. The kick went up, and it was good. A team that could have been called the greatest in the last 25 years walked off the field with nothing. The 1998 Vikings shattered the ceiling of what was thought possible in the modern NFL, only to drop the pieces on their own feet. Missing the Super Bowl entirely detached them from the 84 49ers and 85 Bears comparisons, exiling them to a different, agonizing sub-tier of history. The greatest teams to never win it all. The Vikings hadn't changed at all. They were still the terribly talented, ultimate underachievers.